All right. Welcome, folks who are pouring in here. Appreciate you joining us tonight. We got Dr. Craig Harper out of the University of Tennessee, who is going to present some findings on how you can be more successful, particularly, hunting fields, food plots, when targeting those older age class bucks. So with that, Dr. Harper, what are you and your students been looking at recently as far as whitetail deer studies?
Well, we've had lots of fun lately. One student, Mark Turner, is running all over the eastern United States looking at deer morphometrics and available nutrition and how nutrition influences deer morphometrics. I've got a couple of others that are looking at the effects of fire in pine stands and the different seasons of fire and how that influences food for deer, as well as use by turkeys and other species. Spencer Marshall and Jake Bones are working on it. Lindsey Phillips is working on a wild turkey project, and Joe Quayle and Casey Swafford are all working on the Tennessee Turkey Project, and Ellie Birkin is working on a northern bobwhite project on all of the bobwhite focal areas across the state. So we have lots of things going on. It's lots of fun and finding out some interesting information.
That's super cool. It's fun that you get to work, really on changing landscapes and understanding how different manipulations to those landscapes affect different species of wildlife. That keeps it ever interesting, getting to do some turkey, some quail, some whitetail.
That's well put. That is precisely what I like to do. Most of the research that I'm involved with is applied habitat management oriented, and it is absolutely intoxicating to see how you can manipulate vegetation and influence how wildlife use a particular area.
Very cool. All right, well, some housekeeping before I fully turn it over to Dr. Harper here to drop a bunch of knowledge that I know I am eager to learn, as well as all you are. So the chat is a great place in order to just shoot it back and forth with one another, talk about where you're from, what you've been seeing for deer on your property, what you planted, whatever. Keep it cordial in the chat. Great spot for that. And then if you have any questions, the Q&A spot would greatly appreciate if you do not put them in the chat and put them in the Q&A. I'll be monitoring that as this goes on, collecting those questions. And Dr. Harper is going to leave a little bit of time at the end of this presentation in order to answer some of those questions for you guys. So please fire those away. And this is pretty much a presentation straight out of NDA, the National Deer Association's Deer Steward 1 course. And we'll be giving away a free seat to that Deer Steward course here in about a half hour, 40 minutes. We will post the giveaway link in the chat. You have to be present in order to win that. So that giveaway link will be posted. I'll quick touch on that when we do post it. But yeah, please keep it cordial, ask some great questions. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Harper, to share your knowledge.
Okay, let's see if we can make this thing work.
Perfect. Go into presentation. Yep, looks good. So it is all you good from here.
All right. Well, as mentioned, and as you can see, I wanted to talk about managing fields. Most people who own property have fields, and a lot of people don't realize all of the different things that they can do with their fields to improve them for deer and also for your deer hunting. So that's what we're going to concentrate on tonight. But before I get into any nuts and bolts, Ben Westfall asked me to remember to mention the NDA. I don't work for the NDA, I work with the NDA. And I have had great experiences working with Ben and Kip Adams and all the folks at NDA over the years, and especially Matt. The Deer Steward 1 course is tremendous. If you're interested in taking a deep dive into wildlife, into whitetail deer biology and management, this is the place to do it. Not only does Ben, Kip, and Matt speak, but outside speakers such as myself, Marcus Lashley at the University of Florida, Bronson Strickland at Mississippi State, Will Goolsby at Auburn, Gino D'Angelo at the University of Georgia. There's several speakers from outside the agency that is involved in the Deer Steward 1 course and cover all kinds of topics. So everything about biology and management for deer, not only population management, but habitat management as well. It's certainly well worth your time, money, and involvement to get into it. And then, of course, once you complete the Deer Steward 1, you can go into Deer Steward 2, which is in person, and we go outside and do lots of things for that. So anyway, a little plug there for the NDA and Deer Steward 1. It's a great program. All right. So why should we care about managing our fields? Well, I would hope that it's obvious, so we can provide more and better food and cover. And most of the food for deer in fields is going to be the leaves of forbs. And I'll describe more of that here in just a little bit. But of course, there's also benefits from the soft mast that can be provided. There's cover not only for deer fawns, but for adult deer as well. And that can be both in the summertime as well as the winter. So you're really maximizing food and cover benefit across your property, and you can make more of the property usable at all times of the year for deer and other species as well. So related to food, let's compare the food availability in what I'm going to call early successional areas, and those are areas that are dominated by shade-intolerant herbaceous plants, mostly forbs, grasses, and some incoming shrubs and trees. Many of these sites are called old fields because historically they might have been a crop field. It might be a hay field or a pasture that has been abandoned and is no longer a working land, but now is just growing whatever comes up from the seed bank. When we compare what's available in those areas to what most people have in their fields, which would be a food plot, you can see that a high quality food plot is typically going to produce somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,000 to 4,000 pounds per acre of high quality deer forage per year. And there are plantings that you can use in management strategies where you might be able to bump that up to 6,000 pounds and even more. But most of the food plots are going to produce somewhere between 1,000 and 4,000 pounds per acre per year. In woodlands that receive approximately 50% sunlight, you're typically going to see somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,000 pounds per year. Whereas in a thinned forest stand, in the first 2 or 3 years after it's been thinned, it's common to get somewhere around 500 to 800 pounds per acre per year. And a forest that is burned, but without canopy disturbance, it hasn't been thinned. And so you typically have 80% or more shade, less than 20% sunlight coming in. In that situation, you're not going to have as much forage produced. It's usually going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 200 to 400 pounds per acre, but sometimes you can get a bit more than that. In an unmanaged forest stand where you're looking at closed canopy, typically you're not going to have much forage available there, 25, maybe 100 pounds or so. And when we compare that with early succession, commonly we get 1,000 pounds per acre, and certainly you can get more than that in situations such as this, where we have measured in excess of 3,000 pounds per acre. Now, what I want to mention here is that I'm not talking about biomass. This is the pounds of actual deer food. This is only counting the species, the plant species that deer eat, and the parts of the plant that deer typically eat. So let's look at what deer need with regard to nutrition. Estimates have shown that they typically eat somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 to 5% of their body weight per day, and that's in dry weight forage, so that's a lot. But if you look and think about it, that's quite a big range, 2 to 5%. So it's easy for deer in some areas to have more than twice the amount in other areas. And how might that affect their weights? That can be significant. Of course, high quality forage in spring and summer is most important. Now, it's different when you get up into Pennsylvania and Michigan and obviously north of there, where certainly you can have winter kill. but south of those latitudes, we're not seeing deer killed by winter. And what most people are interested in is growing as large bucks as they can, and to have healthy does and healthy fawns. And that starts in spring and summer with high quality nutrition. Deer are growing antlers from April through July. By the end of July, 90% of the antler growth is done. And so we're really concentrating on providing high quality forage during the spring and summertime, and a lot of it to maximize the genetic potential of deer and see what we can get out of it. Now, there's a few numbers here that I want you to keep in mind as I go through this presentation. For optimum growth, bucks require approximately 16% crude protein for antler growth, 0.2% calcium for maximum antler growth, and 0.1% phosphorus for maximum antler growth. And of course, the nutritional requirements for a lactating doe are a little higher because she's having to supply milk for her fawns. But with regard to the bucks, keep these numbers in mind as we go along. We call deer concentrate selectors because they concentrate their feeding on select plants and select plant parts. And if you ever notice, like that picture of winged elm right there, where deer are commonly selecting the leaves out towards the end, the youngest leaves and the twig ends, because that's where the plants are most tender, most digestible, and they're typically getting the most nutrients from in those leaves and plant parts. Forbs are most important because as a group, they contain more nutrition than other plants. A possible exception at times are the sprouts off of stumps, which are very high, very high in mineral content. But as a plant group, forbs are king with regard to nutrition. So we look at the different types of forbs that deer typically eat. We know that when they're available, they dominate the deer's diet during spring and summer. And if you're interested in other species such as wild turkey and northern bobwhite, for example, many of the forbs are also critically important for them, not only because they can provide outstanding brooding cover, but also because of the seed availability and also the insects that are tied to the forbs, more so than the grasses. So managing fields with a higher coverage of forbs is certainly to your advantage if you're looking to manage the property for wild turkeys and northern bobwhite as well. So the plant composition matters. Just having a field of green is not necessarily great, because according to which plant species you have in the fields, that's going to strongly influence the available nutrition that is in the field. And so what I've done here is just put together a smorgasbord of different forb species that are fairly common throughout much, or at least specific portions of the eastern U.S., and many of these can be found in the western U.S. as well. But keeping in the heart of the distribution of white-tailed deer, just looking at several of these, what I wanted you to notice is the high nutritional value in these plants. When you look at percent crude protein values in the high teens and in the 20s, percent phosphorus of 0.2 to 0.5. I mean, this is outstanding. Remember what a buck needs for maximum antler growth, and look at those percent calcium content. Remember a buck 0.2% calcium, and these plants are producing in excess, most of them, of 1%. So you can see how providing these plants is meeting the nutritional requirement of deer. And this is just a small example of the minerals and nutrients that are available in these plants. You can have nutritional analysis conducted on the plants to find out everything that's in them, but they are outstanding with regard to their nutritional quality. Although most people view these plants as, quote, weeds. But a weed is actually an unwanted plant, and for deer forage, these are definitely wanted. A lot of people are worried about the soils in their region, that they won't be able to have as high quality nutrition for deer because they're in an area that is of poor soil quality, and also the old dogma that the biggest deer are produced in the areas with the best soils. Well, We've looked at that a lot over the past several years, and I want to show you some data that I think are fairly interesting. We took the soil productivity index map, and if you look there on the right in the legend, it goes from 0 to 19 different soil quality classes. And so we group these into groups of 5, 0 to 4 and 5 to 9, etc. So we have 5 soil productivity classes, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, 1 being the least productive, 5 being the most productive. And you can see we went all over the eastern US, and we went from the very best to the very poorest, collecting plant and soil samples in all of these spots. We collected a bunch of deer forages in 16 different states. As you can see there, we collected young leaves and older leaves separately. And wherever we collected the plants, we also collected soil samples right there. So we were able to analyze both and see what kind of interaction and relationship there was. And so I'll share with you just a few data. I mean, I could talk about this for 2 hours, but here's just some data looking at the crude protein of ragweed in the different soil classes there on the top, average phosphorus that you see in the middle, and the average calcium. And you can see that there is essentially no relationship to soil quality when you look at the different classes of soils. And so you can see down at the bottom with soil class 5, there's a little higher on average percent calcium than some of the lower classes, but take note of what those values are. In excess of 2%. And growing bucks only need a maximum of 0.2%. So you can see here that calcium is not the limitation when these plants are available. And of course, this is just ragweed, a common annual forb. For a perennial forb, here are the values of pokeweed, and you can see how that varies over the soil classes. There's no relationship there, showing that increased nutritive value from going from a poor quality soil to a better quality soil, whether we're talking about crude protein, phosphorus, or calcium. Here's a bramble, blackberry. Of course, there's lots of species of blackberry, but wherever you go, it's usually at least a medium quality plant and medium in selectivity by deer for foraging. And you can see the nutritional values there and how that there's very little variation as you go from soil class 1 to soil class 5. So I'm not saying that soils are not important. Soils are very important, but they're mostly important with regard to carrying capacity. And I'm going to try to show this to you in a couple of pictures. Now here, I'm in West Tennessee in a very high quality soil resource region at Ames Plantation. You see the common ragweed, and I took this picture on August the 28th. This ragweed is taller than 7 feet. Crude protein content of 19%, 0.3% phosphorus, and 3.4% calcium. Outstanding quality, even at this date, when I am pulling only the young leaves that have recently been produced, because the plant has grown throughout the summertime. Now think about how much biomass has been produced here for deer. Now, if I go to a very low soil resource region, Fort Bragg in the Sandhills of North Carolina, this is about a week or so later on September the 11th. Look at the values, the nutritional values of the ragweed: 19% crude protein, 0.3% phosphorus, 1.9% calcium. If we look back, virtually identical. But look at how much was produced. So how many deer can this site feed as opposed to this site? Of course, this site has a much higher carrying capacity than this site. However, if deer density is low enough such that these plants are not limiting to the deer to gain the nutrition, we're seeing deer such as this. And Marcus Lashley was working on his PhD project at NC State on Fort Bragg and got these pictures with trail cameras where deer density was low, where there was very frequent disturbance, and where high quality plants were available. And this is unquestionably in one of the poorest soil resource regions in the country. So think about this. Next time you go to the beach, this is on the sand dune at Wrightsville Beach in North Carolina. Of course, you walk out there barefooted and you'll get greenbriers sticking in your feet. It's kind of aggravating, but they don't usually get very tall. Why is that? Well, it's not because of the nutrients. It certainly can support the plants, and you see the nutritional value there, but a lack of water in the sand. And so you don't get as much growth. And so this is just, I think, a neat example of how even on areas with very poor soil quality, you still can have high quality plants because those plants are adapted to those conditions. All right, let's move on. Structure. I would argue that structure is probably the most important determinant for most wildlife species in terms of their occupancy, where they occur. And we know for deer through various studies that use of an area increases with structure that is somewhere in the neighborhood of 4 to 6 feet tall, which, and we all know this, which limits visibility. Deer like it fairly tight with regard to cover. And you can do and see the same thing in your fields. So in this field right here, you see vegetation that is 6 to 7 feet tall there on the right. And then here you see vegetation that is only 1 to 2 feet tall. And that can have a strong influence on deer use of the site. Of course, the first determinant of the structure is the plant species, because of course some plants grow taller than other plants. And so working on your species composition is important with regard to the structure, but also your management. By having more frequent management, you might have a lower structure determined by which plant species are on the site. But at least in the eastern U.S., where rain is not limiting and you're getting 30 plus inches a year, and boy, here we've been getting it. I think we're going to be on average to 60 inches per year here in East Tennessee this year. If you delay your disturbance by 3 to 5 years, you're going to have a fair amount of woody growth into the field, and that way you can influence the structure in a big way if you would rather have more bedding as opposed to more forage. On the right, that's a field after it was burned fairly recently, and you can see in this case it's being managed more for forage than for the cover to hold deer. Of course, the structure at ground level is important. If it's not clogged up with thatch and dense grass, then the seed bank, and that is the collection of seed that occurs naturally in the top few inches of soil, the seed bank can germinate and grow. And then if you have that type of structure, then you typically can see increased plant species richness and have increased species of plants that deer typically prefer. And I'll show more pictures of that in just a little bit. But you can see what the structure is like when you have dense grass, and that inhibits the seed bank from germinating, and that lowers your species richness, and that will dramatically lower both the nutritional carrying capacity for deer as well as the structure for deer. The soil nutrition also influences the structure. So here is on a site with relatively poor soils that has had no amendment. Now this site was disked earlier in the winter, and here we are on the 8th of August. Now, you see where the structure is on Jason here, but if we walk over to the left and we see where we have applied lime and fertilizer according to soil test, now we have increased the structure by early August nearly up to his chest. And so even within a given species, you can have a strong influence on structure by adjusting soil fertility with amendments. So both your management as well as amendments can strongly influence the structure. Okay, where do we get started? With regard to evaluation, look at which species of plants are on the field. And in many cases, a lot of fields, I'm gonna say most fields, are covered by grass. And most of these are non-native grasses, and we all have our non-native grass problems. If you're in the Northeast, you've certainly got tall fescue and orchard grass and timothy. In the Mid-South, tall fescue and Bermuda grass. On the coastal plain, Bermuda grass and Bahia grass. In the Midwest, smooth brome and reed canary grass. There's non-native grasses that carpet the ground all over the eastern U.S. And of course, western U.S. has their problems with non-native grasses also. And of course, they suppress the seed bank, decrease plant diversity, decrease the forb cover, which is so important, and thus decrease available nutrition. For perennial cool season grasses, the best time to spray to get rid of them is in the fall. And I like to wait until after a couple of frosts, because oftentimes there may be warm season plants growing as well. And so after a couple of frosts, the warm season plants, most of them either have died or gone into winter senescence. And at that time, the cool season plants are still actively growing before we get hard freezes. And it is at that time that you can get your best kill on perennial cool season grasses to then release the seed bank the following spring. For Bermuda grass, and I'm just going to run through a couple of examples here. Here we are burning off a field to have fresh Bermuda grass growth. Then into spring and early summer, we have Bermuda grass greened up all over the field. We apply an application of imazapyr, and then by August, the field is dead. But watch, there will always be recurring patches of Bermuda grass greening back up. We like to spot spray those with a 5% solution of glyphosate, because glyphosate is not soil active. You don't want to use imazapyr again twice in the season, because then you're going to have a dead field for quite some time because of the residual activity. So use glyphosate at a relatively high rate for spot spraying the recurring patches of Bermuda grass that green back up. And here we are just one season after controlling Bermuda grass, and you can see how the nutrition and the structure has improved dramatically for deer. Here's another example where the Bermuda grass was sprayed and then and nothing planted, and a short time later, I mean, this is absolutely outstanding. Lots of partridge pea, ragweed, asters, several other plants in there. For Bahia grass, a different chemical, metsulfuron methyl, which is in Escort or Cimarron, and sometimes we'll add plateau to that for residual annual grass control, especially for crabgrass, but also for Johnson grass, which is a perennial. And if you're on the coastal plain, of course, you're liable to have sand burr, which is an annual grass, and that can be problematic. So that residual effect of the plateau is very good there. Smooth brome in Illinois, another cool season perennial, as is reed canary grass. In those situations, we typically just use glyphosate in the fall after a couple of frosts and can get a good kill on them. But you're going to have to be ready for a little bit of reapplication. You're going to have some coming back after this, but you can get rid of it. Do we need to plant? That's the next question. Do we need to plant native warm season grasses and forbs? Well, in all of the work that we've done over so many states in the eastern U.S., my answer is almost never. There are some examples where you do need to plant, but not usually. Whether you could see here, New York, Michigan, South Carolina, North Carolina, Tennessee, these are all fields that were covered in non-native grass, either tall fescue or Bermuda grass for most of them. The grasses were sprayed and then left alone. Sometimes the dead material was burned off the field, sometimes not. And this is simply free. This is what's waiting in the seed bank once you give it a chance to respond. And Wade Jafellers was a past graduate student of mine, and he finished a project where we had 18 sites across Tennessee and Alabama where we compared plant composition and structure by planting native warm season grasses and forbs and just by using the seed bank. We started in all of these fields that were dominated by tall fescue. Our initial treatment was to spray the tall fescue in the fall, and then the following spring, We planted areas to native grasses and forbs, and we left other areas alone just for the seed bank to respond. So for each field, 1/3 of the field was left in control, existing tall fescue that was not sprayed. 1/3 of the field was planted, and 1/3 of the field was sprayed and left alone without planting. And here you can see what the percentages look like with regard to relative coverage, how most of the control, of course, was tall fescue, and I'll show you the actual amounts here in a second, but these are the relative amounts where we're looking at non-native grasses, non-native forbs, and native grasses and forbs, as well as some woody and bramble species. And then if we look at the natural revegetation, or just the seed bank response, and the planted portions, it's almost identical. This was very surprising to me. This was very surprising in that the proportion of the different plant types almost mirrored each other, whether we used the seed bank alone without planting or whether we planted native grasses and forbs. When we look at the actual coverage of the different plant types, you can see here that with the natural revegetation in gray, we're in excess of 50% forbs across the field, and this is in the 3rd growing season after spraying the tall fescue. And then also in the natural revegetation, without planting anything, we have right at 50% coverage of native grass. That right there is very telling. Even without planting grass, within 3 years, on a majority of sites, you are going to need to do something to reduce grass density. Unless we're talking about a grassland obligate songbird, such as a Henslow sparrow, a grasshopper sparrow, an eastern meadowlark, there's no wildlife species in the eastern United States that requires or needs more than 30% grass cover. The forbs are that much more important. Think about this when you go out and look at your fields. So we measured the structure, the vertical structure from ground up, and look at how the natural revegetation, only using the seed bank, is mirroring that of the planted, and how it is taller, of course, than the tall fescue control. And so we have drastically improved the vertical structure by limiting the visibility, which deer strongly prefer, especially for bedding and loafing. So what that has led me to recommend over the years in most situations is to simply kill what you don't like instead of planting what you like. And I'll show some pictures of that here in just a little bit. But you can see how the nutritional carrying capacity for deer has increased over that of planting just by using the seed bank. And this is just within 3 years after spraying the non-native grass cover. If you do plant, I would strongly encourage you to stay away from this situation right here where you have really heavy native grass, whether it be big blue stem, Indian grass, switchgrass, etc. Yes, deer may lay in some of these fields, especially in wintertime when the direct sun rays are coming down, especially in switchgrass, but there is no food. And how many properties do I go to that look like this? Somebody is feeling really good that, look, I got my native grasses planted, I've got this bedding cover, and then look in the background, corn food plots, closed canopy woods. Folks, the nutritional carrying capacity for deer in this picture during spring and summer when deer are growing antlers is near to zero. They're not going to eat these grasses. Yes, deer may eat green growing corn if there's hardly anything else to eat. I have seen that. I'm sure some of you have seen that as well. But the nutritional value in this picture is rock bottom compared to having a field full of randomly occurring weeds. This is dripping with irony that we are planting things that are not providing nutrition for deer when we could get free food and free cover in most instances out of the seed bank. Of course, big blue stem and Indian grass fall over in the winter. Switchgrass will remain standing, as I said, provides cover in winter, but the food value is zero, as opposed to this. Whether it be in the summer or in the wintertime. So if you have too much grass and you're wanting to reduce native grass density, we've looked at lots of different herbicides and rates, and the two that we have come up with that do the best job is 2 quarts per acre of glyphosate in spring when the grasses get to about 3 feet tall, or with Arsenal, which contains imazapyr. About the same time, you can reduce grass density down to about 10 to 30%, and of course, increase the coverage of forbs. Now, take a look at this. What do you think? Are you seeing a field of weeds? Or are you seeing that's about 1,500 pounds of deer forage per acre? And you wouldn't have to walk far out there before you would jump a fawn and adult deer as well. It's our perception. We see clean, green, and even. We like clean, green, and even. We see this right here as, man, Craig, that's looking snaky. I need to get that mowed. Just why? Look at it through a deer's eyes, not through our ancestors' eyes. How about this? I bet a lot of people just started smiling. Oh, look at that gorgeous pollinator planting. But the nutritional value for deer is not even close to what these fields of naturally occurring weeds are. And the structure is nowhere near as good as the naturally occurring plants with regard to bedding cover and loafing cover. So think about that. I know a lot of people use this, and this you can get in programs that really help. I'm not casting dispersion there, that's fine. But think about these naturally occurring plants and how you don't have to plant something to have something beneficial. So I'm going to go through a couple of real world examples here, what I might call some success stories. This is of a property in the Piedmont of North Carolina, 2,500 acres. And if you remember the soil resource region map that I showed you, this property is from 0 to 19. This property is a 4. So it's in soil class 1 where I was showing you those graphs. Well, this property owner decided to abandon row crops they had been trying to manage for quail, abandon row crops, let all the fields grow up, and go to early succession. They had planted quite a bit of native warm season grasses, thinking that that was good for bobwhite. We got them to kill the native grasses, or at least the majority of them, and burn that out and allow the seed bank to respond, as you see right here. They had feeders. Of course, they got rid of them. Thank goodness. Tipped them over, sold them, saved tons of money. Reduced the amount of food plots. In fact, had no warm season food plots after abandoning the row crops. Had corn and soybeans on rotation, abandoned that, allowed the fields to grow up in weeds, either spot sprayed, disc, or burned the fields a portion of each year. The only food plots that they had were a few small green plots that they, of course, use for hunting. And within 4 years, they began shooting big deer. Net, Boone and Crockett, grossing, this one obviously in the 170s. Another one, 4-year-old buck. No, these are not 200-inch whitetails, but remember where we are. The Piedmont of North Carolina, red clay. These deer are grown on weeds. Body weights increasing by 10 to 20% on average, some more than that. No high fence, no feeders, no mineral licks, few food plots, soil class 4 of 19. Another one, And I'm showing you these in fairly poor soil resource regions, so you can see that this is working in places where you might not think possible. Upper coastal plain of South Carolina, relatively sandy soils, a large pen-raised quail plantation. As you see, a sea of grass. You know, we always have this picture of sparse pine trees and a sea of grass underneath as being good for quail. No, they need more forbs also, and they certainly need more shrub cover. So it's not a wonder that many of these properties have to release birds. Nonetheless, small deer, they wanted larger deer. And so we got them to disc more, which of course would help the bobwhite, but also would help the deer with regard to naturally occurring available nutrition. They started disking 70% of the property of which was 9,000 acres, disking 7% of it annually, and turned it into this. Transformed a sea of grass into at least a much larger component of forbs. And within 4 years, remember, upper coastal plain of South Carolina, 4-year-old, 5-year-old, 3-year-old, 4-year-old, 163 gross 5-year-old, 209 pounds, 178 gross 4-year-old, 190 pounds, again, grown primarily on naturally occurring forages. Soil productivity class 3 of 19. So how do we maintain this? Let me go through a few slides here talking about how we manage and maintain. Of course, there are 3 primary ways. One is herbicide applications. And after you make an initial herbicide application, a broadcast application to reduce what would be a covering of dense unwanted grass, then we're primarily looking at spot spray applications. And again, we're killing undesirable plants and leaving those that we like. Then we're using fire, and depending on what I'm trying to get out of the field, if I'm trying to manage it primarily for forage, then I might burn every 1 or 2 years. If I want to manage it more for cover, then I might not manage it, but every 3 to 5 years, depending on the site and the plant response. I'm always alternating my seasons of burning. I'm never burning only during the dormant season. I'm always incorporating some growing season fire into the management regime, especially burning in July and August, and then you're going to get fresh growth that deer will flock to at the end of the growing season, and you actually can steer deer to come into certain areas of the field to begin feeding on these newly sprouted, naturally occurring plants. Of course, disking is a great way to set back succession and stimulate lots of annual forbs. Here's a picture of a field that's managed every 2 to 3 years simply by disking. And usually, if we're going to manage a field by disking, we will manage a portion of it and then rotate the disking around, where we're disking maybe a half of the field 1 year, another half the other year, or a third. But generally, within 1 to 3 years, we're disking every section. And try to avoid mowing as your primary means of setting back succession. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't ever mow. Okay, you know, there's trails that might need to be mowed, and you might need to mow at a certain time to manipulate the plant so you can get a better herbicide application or what have you. But as your primary tool of setting back succession, you're going to be so much better off by using fire or disking and herbicide applications, especially spot spray, rather than mowing. Mowing leads to increased thatch buildup. It leads to decreased species richness over time, and it typically leads to lots of grass. And Bonner Powell finished a project here just a couple of years ago where he looked at looking at those same fields Wade did, but Bonner put a management practice on top of that, where he had planted mowed sections, planted burn sections, seed bank mowed, and seed bank burned. And you can see how the nutritional carrying capacity for deer was greatest in those fields that had regrown from the seed bank and where we used fire. So let me show a couple of pictures of spot spraying and what we do. This can be a little difficult to grasp, but if you drive around a field, pulling a bush hog, you're going to drive over every square inch of it. And your strips where you mow are going to be adjacent, of course. When you're spot spraying, you can go across the field in the same pattern, but your strips might be 50 to 75 feet apart because you can spray on either side of the tractor or the ATV. And I typically like to spray with a open cab tractor, 30, 40 horsepower tractor. And I'm sitting up over the vegetation. I can see down quite well. Low range, first gear, steering with my left hand, spray gun in my right hand, just driving along, enjoying life. And when I see something I don't like, I spray it and kill it. And then, as you see here on the right, what you sprayed, of course, dies. And we're just using glyphosate. It's an equal opportunity germinator. Whether it's a forb or a grass, it can germinate after that area was killed. And that way, regardless of whether we're trying to get rid of Sericea lespedeza or some kind of grass or woody sprouts that we don't like, calorie pear, or whatever the case may be, we're going to kill it. So usually a 2% solution of glyphosate, but with some problem plants, we might bump that up to 5. And so in these sprayed areas, we will come back about 3 weeks later with a drip torch and burn them. And you can do this strategically with regard to where you're going to hunt the field. So in your stand, you can look out into strips that you have intentionally sprayed at certain times of the year and then burned, and everything is green around you. And so unless there's a lot of dead thatch, you don't even need a fire break. If you burn under the appropriate conditions, the only thing that's going to burn is that dead vegetation in the areas that you spot sprayed. And then within the second rain, green coming all back up, and you'll see deer move into these areas to feed on this fresh vegetation. And that's how we're maintaining fields that look like this. Of course, one limitation with this type of management is your vegetation identification skills. You've got to be able to at least identify the primary plants in the field. And what I tell people is learn the 10 most prevalent plants. That's not hard. And once you do that, you can pick up another one as time goes on, and then pick up another one. But if you learn the 10 dominant plants in the field, you're going to be able to manage the field appropriately and really go forward with regard to having a better composition of plants and getting rid of the ones that you don't want. Another question that I commonly get is about trees and shrubs coming in. They can be very beneficial, whether that's sumac or persimmon. For thermal cover in summer, there's almost always deer beds under these just for the shade because it's cooler under there. Soft mass by several different species that you can leave in the field. And if too many of them begin to sprout up, then you can spot spray those that you want and keep it at a level that you want. And then lastly, the location and how we might think about hunting this. Of course, upland sites are best because it's difficult to maintain bottomland areas. Of course, it's too wet. It's more difficult to burn there. It's more difficult to disc. And so keeping your early succession to the upland sites are going to be best. These are going to be great sources of bedding cover in midday and outstanding for morning hunts when deer go into these fields about 9 o'clock in the morning. Once the sun gets up and it's starting to get some good direct solar rays coming into the field on those cold mornings, these are magnets for deer, and you always see deer coming into these spots on those types of mornings. Great areas for morning hunts. Of course, you can use adjacent food plots or plant the fire breaks around the field, and that then can steer deer movement to use various sections of the field. And of course, you can use that to your advantage. And then here we have mowed some lanes, and the deer will typically, because of the lack of visibility, which is good, that's making them hang out in the field. And you will sit there in the stand, and all of a sudden a deer will just appear because they're bedding out there. they want to be able to see who else is in there. So they will walk to these lanes and look down them. And of course, you're looking down the lanes. And so that can aid you in terms of seeing mature bucks. This is a fairly low scoring buck, but he was 5 years old and one that was eating food, and we decided to take him out. So in conclusion, just number one, first off, eradicate the non-native grasses. That's the lowest hanging fruit there is. Manage your fields with what I might call alternative management approaches, fire and spot spraying and disking, and try to limit the mowing, especially to manage the succession. And whatever you do, try to avoid mowing during the spring and summertime. That's the absolute worst time. If you have to mow, then concentrate your mowing in late winter, just before spring green up. It's a lot easier to mow at that time, and you won't disturb fawning cover, you won't disturb nesting cover, etc. Consider your arrangement. Think about your management on the uplands and where you can maintain early succession most easily, and keep records of what you do. What you sprayed, how often, when you dissed, etc. It's very difficult to remember all this, and keeping a log of that will help you in a big way as you go forward. So, Jared, that's all I have. If there's questions, I'm happy to sit and try to answer as many as we can.
Yeah, no, that was awesome. And I mean, very insightful. I mean, I know I learned a ton, and I'm sure a bunch of these other folks did here as well. We do have some questions coming in. So one of them is where, it was just asked, what chemicals are you using to spot kill? And there was a couple others that were similar to that. And so, like, is there a compiled place of information on what to spray on what plants at what times of the year? Is there a book of truth of sorts, if you will, for that?
Well, I've written a few things, so they can go to my webpage, and there is a publication, Managing Early Successional Plant Communities in the Eastern U.S. And I would argue that has the most comprehensive list of herbicide applications, herbicides, and the plants that they control throughout the text, but also in in one of the appendices.
And what is your website?
If you Google my name and the University of Tennessee, it'll pop right up.
That's perfect.
I don't remember all those letters and everything else. So just
Dr. Craig Harper, University of Tennessee, and go exploring. Before I forget, giveaway link. It was just posted in the chat. We're going to post it again here in a second. It is only open for the next few hours to the folks in this webinar. So make sure you click that giveaway link, get it filled out, and hopefully win a spot in the Dear Steward 1 course, where you're going to learn a whole lot more information like this. All right, another one here. So of the phosphorus, calcium, and crude protein, what does that look like for row crops like corn and soybeans? Like, what are those nutritional values, and how do they compare to the Forbes? Taking into account, the different seasons at which they become ripe, if you will.
Right. That's a great question. For soybeans, they're going to have a little higher crude protein content on average than many of the naturally occurring Forbes, but not all of them. Pokeweed, for example, is commonly up in the 30s with regard to crude protein, and with regard to the calcium and phosphorus and some of the other micronutrients, they're going to be very similar to what you would find in the naturally occurring forages. Corn is going to be lower. That would be a food that you're looking at for the sugar content and for the energy in fall and winter, not for spring and summer. I've often said corn has never put an inch on a deer's head. It can't. The crude protein and phosphorus and calcium is too low, and that's you do not want to be feeding corn during the growing season. You want deer to be eating much higher quality plants than that.
Very interesting. So this one comes from Minnesota, but really a lot of folks in the Northeast and upper Midwest can relate. Seems by September, for sure by the beginning of October, all forbs are beginning to go dormant. Will deer still use and eat these forbs once they start to turn brown? Or is that pretty much a lost cause at that point, and forbs are really that early season, late spring, early summer food source?
Another good question. And the vast majority of forage available from the forbs is going to be in the spring and summer. For many of them, when they die, that's it. However, there are others that produce what we call a winter rosette. And you can walk along in the field, and many of these plants will have little small basal leaves coming out of the stem, usually maybe 3 to 6 inches in diameter around the stems, and deer will eat those, but the majority of the nutritional benefit is going to be in the spring and summer. Once the cooler weather with fall comes on, and especially after frost, then more of the foraging is going to turn to browse, which is the few leaves and of course twig ends that are left on woody and semi-woody species, and of course also to hard mast, especially acorns and beech nuts and other things that come available at that time.
All right, so this question came in, before you started showing those controlled studies versus planted and, just the seed bank, but your deer plant smorgasbord slide, the question was, where's a good place to get seeds for those plants, which I'd like to hear some information on that. But on top of that, how do some of those seed banks, in the soil across the country work when so many of those things are a monoculture of a specific grass or things of that nature? How do those seed banks get built up, and how long do those seeds stay viable?
Yeah, that's another good question. Let's see, I could spend like an hour talking about this. Think of if you're in the woods and you cut trees down that are 100 years old. You cut all the trees down, and now there's immediate sunlight coming on. It explodes with the green. Many of these plants can remain viable in the seed bank for decades and even 100 years or longer. Some of this is not known exactly how long, and it differs by plant species, of course. So the seed bank can remain intact for a very, very long time. And that carpet of grass that smothers the seed bank and prohibits it from germinating. But when that is removed, it'll germinate and come out. Now, even on areas that have been row cropped for 30 plus years, it is surprising at how many plants will come out once those fields are allowed to go fallow and they're not planted anymore. That has certainly surprised me. Now, I'm not saying that you're going to have the pristine seed bank from 1712 in southeast Iowa when you stop planting corn and soybeans, okay? But there is a seed bank with all of the weed seed that is dispersed through wind, water, and animals. And there is a reason why crop producers spray herbicides every single year, because stuff keeps coming back and coming in. And some of this can be very good for deer and some of it not. And so the seed bank is persistent for a very long time, and it differs from site to site. And it can differ even within fields on a given property because of the past site history of those fields.
Interesting. That's crazy that those seed banks can last for decades, maybe even centuries.
And what I would do is when they were asking about planting some of those, you can find quite a number of naturally occurring plants that have been cultivated that you can get seed for, but I would just search for that online. There will be various seed dealers that have some of that, and certainly we have done that. We have complemented our management, where in this field we're just not quite getting composition of X, Y, or Z. And then, for example, after burning the field in the fall or winter, we will go in and introduce some of that seed and allow it to sit there over winter with freezing and thawing, and that helps break seed dormancy. And then you can get that coming out the following spring.
Very interesting. All right, one last chance at the giveaway. We just threw it in the chat, and this is going to be the last question here. It is kind of multifaceted, but so with growing thors forbs and those weeds that produce so much of the needed nutrients that deer need to grow their antlers, a lot of like the upper Midwest was in a pretty heavy drought late spring, early summer this year. Obviously at other times, it's steady rainfall like you talked about down where you're at, almost double the average annual rainfall for, that early growing season, early summer, late spring. What can you do to ensure that these forbs and these beneficial weeds are producing the amount of food that they're capable of during drought, during floods? What kind of what kind of things can you do to help those ecosystems?
Well, yeah, not much of anything. The interesting thing is these plants are tolerant to most of those conditions. Now, extreme drought, yes, you'll see them wilt down during those times. But how many times, I was just on a property with a very popular and highly influential person not long ago, and they were lamenting about how their food plots are just wilting down. And I looked over here beside the food plot and I said, well, look at all of this. And it was, various forbs, weeds coming up. And I said, this ragweed, this lamb's quarters, this pokeweed, it's trucking along doing just fine. This old field aster, for example. And they looked and said, wow, you're right. I mean, the clovers are literally wilted down on the ground, but those plants are doing just fine. And we walked over there and sure enough, leaves nipped off all over the plants. And so if you're not getting as much growth out of those plants as you would like, and don't overlook this, I tried to point this out, take soil samples, have them tested from your county extension office, and apply some lime. If the pH is low, I like to get pH up at 6.0 and maybe up into 6.5. That releases more of the nutrients that are available to these plants. And then you might also apply a fertilizer, not that much, but, a relatively low rate containing some nitrogen, and you'll see those plants really coming out, especially when you apply in springtime and just before rain. If you manage your fields by dragging a bush hog around behind a tractor, as I used to do for years and years, and you try this, you won't go back. You won't go back. There are so many opportunities for you to manage your fields differently and to enhance your hunting. And, you'll start getting into it and you'll think of, strips here or blocks there and how you're burning some of that. And you'll begin to see how the deer respond to all this. And it's really fun.
Yeah, this has been a bunch of people have put this in the chat, how insightful and how this has been one of the most interesting and eye-opening webinars that they've attended of ours. And I couldn't agree more. I've learned a ton here, and I think you are ultimately going to save a couple hundred people a lot of time, a lot of money, and a lot of sweat equity. Because
very good. Yeah. I hope we covered something that somebody can use and they'll have fun with and realize even more success with their hunting and more enjoyment out of it.
Awesome. Well, this recording of this webinar will be sent to all of you attendees. It'll also be posted on the Onyx Hunt YouTube channel tomorrow. So Dr. Harper, cannot thank you enough for your time and your knowledge. And everyone else, thank you for attending and joining us this evening. And best of luck as you guys are out there watching antlers grow, waiting on opening day.
Absolutely. Good to be with you.
Appreciate it. Have a good evening, everyone.